Welcome back. Tonight we're going to learn more about the Mexican-American War, fought from 1846 to 1848, a pivotal and controversial conflict that reshaped the North American map, sparked by the U.S. annexation of Texas and disputes over its southern border. The war saw American forces push deep into Mexican territory, eventually capturing Mexico City. For Mexico, it was a devastating loss, resulting in the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where nearly half its territory was ceded to the United States, including what is now California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more. For the US, it was a victory that fueled westward expansion, but also intensified tensions over slavery, laying groundwork for the Civil War. The war remains a defining chapter in the complex relationship between the two nations. But before we keep going, I'd love to ask you something. Let me know where you're listening from, maybe what time it is for you right now, and whether you're here to fall asleep, or just passing time while soaking in a bit of history. And while you're at it, I'm genuinely curious. Do you like the visuals I use in these videos? Or would you actually prefer a completely black screen, just the voice and the story? I'd really like to know what helps you feel more comfortable. And of course, if you enjoy these stories, liking the video or subscribing goes a long way in helping me keep doing this, quietly sharing these moments from the past with you. Alright, let's step forward again. There's a quiet kind of violence in a line drawn across a map. A border, declared by one government and rejected by another, seems like such a simple thing, until blood soaks into the ground on either side. Tonight, we begin with one of those lines. It's a story you might think you already know. A short war, a bigger United States, a treaty inked in some distant city, and maybe a footnote or two about Texas. But behind that dry list of outcomes lies a cascade of consequences. Not just for governments, but for families, languages, identities, entire landscapes. The Mexican-American War was not just a land grab or a chapter in a textbook. It was, quite literally, a moment when the earth shifted, and it still echoes beneath our feet. The year is 1846, but to understand how we got there, we need to go back a little further, to a time when the continent itself seemed like a promise waiting to be kept, or, depending on where you stood, a warning waiting to be ignored. Americans at the time had a name for the feeling that coursed through their veins when they looked westward. They called it Manifest Destiny. It wasn't just a political slogan. It was a belief system, almost religious in tone, whispered in newspapers and shouted from pulpits. The idea that Americans were fated, meant, to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, to spread democracy, industry, and Christianity across the vast continent. It sounds noble if you don't look too closely. But for the people who already lived in those spaces, indigenous nations, Mexican ranchers, settlers of Spanish descent, it was a thundercloud on the horizon. At the center of this expanding ambition was a man whose name you might not think about often, but who shaped the war more than perhaps any other. President James K. Polk. Polk was a Tennessean, soft-spoken but relentless. In 1844, he ran for president on a simple, aggressive platform: expand the United States, annex Texas, secure Oregon, take California. He won, and he meant every word. But Texas, old Texas, was already a powder keg. The United States had eyed it for decades, and after the region broke away from Mexico in 1836 to become the Republic of Texas, many in Washington saw it as unfinished business. Mexico, on the other hand, never accepted that breakaway republic. To them, Texas was still part of their country, illegally occupied by a rebellious former province and now being courted by a foreign power. So, when the US officially annexed Texas in 1845, it wasn't just a diplomatic insult. It was, in Mexico's view, an outright theft. Especially because there was still a major disagreement about where Texas actually ended. Americans claimed the border was the Rio Grande. Mexicans insisted it was the Nueces River, about 150 miles to the northeast. And in that dusty, dry stretch of disputed land, two armies would soon stare each other down. There's something chilling about how calmly nations walk toward war. It doesn't always begin with gunfire. Sometimes it starts with letters and maps. Polk sent troops south into the disputed territory, under the command of General Zachary Taylor. Mexico responded by sending its own troops across the Rio Grande. The two sides didn't want to blink, and then it happened. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked a U.S. patrol north of the Rio Grande. Several Americans were killed. Polk took that incident and ran with it. He went to Congress and declared, "Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil." It's a chilling phrase, isn't it? American soil. Because, in truth, no one could agree on whose soil it was. But the war drums beat, and Congress authorized military action. Not everyone was thrilled. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, yes, that Lincoln, challenged the president's narrative. He demanded to know the exact spot where that blood had been shed. "Show me the spot," he said. The spot resolutions, they called it. But Polk ignored the protest. Most of Congress followed him, and soon the war was fully underway. Behind the scenes, some people saw right through it. Henry David Thoreau, the philosopher and writer, was so disgusted by the war that he refused to pay his taxes and protest. For that, he was jailed, briefly. From that act of quiet resistance came a small but powerful essay, Civil Disobedience. A piece of writing that would go on to influence Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and others long after the dust of this war had settled. And yet, despite the doubts, the war machine turned. Thousands of young men enlisted, some driven by patriotism, others by adventure, and quite a few by the promise of land and glory. For many of them, the war didn't feel like conquest. It felt like destiny. But here's something I find haunting. In Mexico, the feeling was very different. The country had already endured years of political instability, economic hardship, and the loss of Texas. For ordinary Mexicans, another war, especially with a rising northern power, felt like a nightmare being repeated. Many soldiers were poorly equipped, underpaid, and led by generals they didn't trust. And yet, they fought with a fierce pride, defending not just land, but identity. In the borderlands, meanwhile, communities braced themselves. Ranchers, merchants, and indigenous tribes watched as armies approached from both sides. For them, this wasn't a distant war. It was a fight that would soon pass right through their homes. As the first battles loomed, the lines were drawn. But these weren't just military lines. They were lines between belief and ambition, between maps and memory, between those who believed they were shaping history and those who feared they were being erased from it. And so it begins. The borderlands grow restless, the air thick with gunpowder and with something else, uncertainty. No one on either side could quite predict how far this war would go, or how different the world would look when it was over. The idea had a name, though not everyone knew it at the time. Manifest destiny. It sounds grand, doesn't it? Righteous, like something handed down from the heavens. A calling, a purpose. It wasn't written in the stars, though. It was written in newspapers, in congressional speeches, in sermons and school books. The phrase itself was coined in 1845 by a New York journalist named John L. O'Sullivan. He said it was America's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. That's the kind of language that wraps conquest in poetry. But what did it mean on the ground? For settlers, for soldiers, for the people already living on the land being overspread. It meant expansion, aggressively, relentlessly, from sea to shining sea. By the time O'Sullivan put those words into print, the US had already swallowed the Louisiana Territory, bought from France in 1803. Then came Florida, acquired from Spain in 1819. And Oregon was in the sights too, shared uneasily with Britain. But Texas was different. Texas had once been a province of Mexico, a vast stretch of plains and scrubland and rivers, barely controlled by the distant government in Mexico City. American settlers had poured in during the 1820s and 30s, invited at first, then resented. When those settlers, mostly from the southern US, rebelled and declared independence in 1836, they weren't just chasing freedom. They were chasing cotton, land, and yes, the expansion of slavery. Mexico never recognized the Republic of Texas. They saw it as stolen land. But many Americans didn't see it that way. They saw a vast, open land that was underdeveloped, underpopulated, and underappreciated, which is a polite way of saying they saw it as theirs for the taking. President James K. Polk didn't hesitate. He was a man of sharp ambition and narrow focus. When he took office in 1845, he had a list: acquire Oregon, acquire California, and bring Texas into the Union. That was the vision. That was manifest destiny in action. And so, in December of that same year, the US Congress voted to annex Texas. Just like that. A flick of the pen, a declaration of inclusion, and an act of war, at least in Mexico's eyes. Because the trouble wasn't just Texas, it was where Texas ended. Mexico said the border was the Nueces River. The United States claimed it was farther south, at the Rio Grande. In between was a contested strip of land, a no-man's land patrolled by soldiers, stalked by bandits, and watched nervously by civilians who didn't know which flag would be flying next month. That little strip, that grey area, would become the spark. But even before shots were fired, there were plenty of Americans who questioned the righteousness of all this. Some called it opportunism, some called it a land grab. Senator Thomas Corwin of Ohio said in 1847, "If I were a Mexican, as I am an American, I would tell you, have you not room in your own country to bury your dead man? If you come into mine, we will greet you with bloody hands and welcome you to hospitable graves." Powerful words, but not enough to slow the tide. Because the settlers kept coming. Families in wagons, traders with mules and pack trains, cotton growers, missionaries, and with them came the army. Always the army. When you look at a map of the US today, that southwestern corner, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, it seems like it always belonged, like it was always meant to be. But in 1845, that was still a gamble, still a dream, still something that had to be taken. And as is often the case in history, the taking would be justified with ideas. It wasn't just divine will that was used to justify this push westward. It was also race. The belief, sometimes loud, sometimes whispered, that Anglo-Americans were superior, more capable of governing, more fit to develop the land than Mexicans or native peoples. It's uncomfortable to say, but it was said, over and over again, in editorials and speeches and everyday conversation. People believed it, that their way of life was more advanced, that their systems, where language, even their religion, gave them not just the right to expand, but a duty to do so. It's strange how certainty can make people so blind. One diary from the era, written by a settler traveling through New Mexico in 1847, described the local adobe homes as primitive hovels, and the people as indolent and backwards. But that same writer marveled at the rich soil, the intricate irrigation systems, the way corn and beans thrived in the sun. The contradiction never seemed to register. And so, manifest destiny rolled on, with covered wagons, cavalry units, and political speeches. The country was hungry, the land was vast, and somewhere in the dust and distance, war was coming. Because while the US saw opportunity, Mexico saw a neighbor growing more threatening by the day. Leaders in Mexico City spoke of honor, of defending the motherland. They were still recovering from internal revolts, bankrupt from years of political instability, and now facing a country that was pushing closer to their capital every season. It's easy to romanticize expansion when you're on the winning side, but for every gain there's a loss. For every mile taken, someone else is pushed out. And when words finally failed, when boundaries weren't enough, the cannons would speak. The road to war had already been paved long before a single musket was fired, or a single soldier crossed a river. And that road passed straight through Texas, a rough, sunburned land that had been tugged back and forth between flags and empires for generations. By the 1830s, Texas was a cauldron of unrest. Officially, it was part of Mexico, but the reality on the ground was far more tangled. Thousands of Anglo-American settlers, invited years earlier by Mexican authorities who hoped to stabilize and develop the frontier, had grown in number, in confidence, and in defiance. Many of them were Southerners, who brought with them not only cotton and ambition, but slavery. And slavery by then was illegal in Mexico. Tensions simmered, then they boiled. In 1836, the Texas Revolution erupted, a short and brutal conflict that still clings to memory in slogans and murals. Names like Sam Houston and Davy Crockett are familiar now, too familiar perhaps. They've become folk heroes, their images polished by time. But if you listen closely, beneath the patriotic songs and grainy schoolroom reenactments, you can still hear the unease. The pivotal moment, of course, came at the Alamo, a crumbling mission in San Antonio, defended by a small, exhausted garrison of Texan rebels, many of them recent arrivals from the US, was besieged by a far larger force led by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, Mexico's self-declared Napoleon of the West. The siege lasted 13 days. On the morning of March 6, 1836, Mexican troops stormed the compound. Nearly all of the defenders were killed. Remember the Alamo would become a battle cry, but at the time, it was just heartbreak and dust. Shortly after, in April, came the stunning reversal. At the Battle of San Jacinto, Sam Houston's army ambushed and overwhelmed Santa Anna's troops in a surprise attack that lasted just 18 minutes. Santa Anna himself was captured while trying to escape disguised in a private's uniform. In exchange for his life, he signed an agreement recognizing Texan independence, an agreement Mexico never ratified. That moment is crucial, because while Texas began calling itself a republic and even flew its own flag, Mexico viewed the region as rebellious territory, not a foreign nation, not a sovereign state, just a province temporarily out of control. And when the United States annexed Texas in 1845, Mexico saw it as theft. To make matters worse, the exact borders of this new American state were anything but clear. Mexico insisted that Texas ended at the Nueces River, a broad ribbon of water roughly 150 miles north of the Rio Grande. The US, on the other hand, claimed the Rio Grande as the rightful border. That slice of land in between, wild, mostly empty and vast, became the fuse. Think of it like this: two neighbors arguing over a patch of dirt between their fences, each convinced it's theirs. One day, one of them starts building a barn on it. The other responds with a shotgun. That's what this was. Except instead of barns and shotguns, it was armies and flags. In 1845, President James K. Polk sent General Zachary Taylor to the disputed region, ordering him to set up camp along the Rio Grande. From the Mexican perspective, this wasn't defense, it was invasion. Meanwhile, Polk had also sent a diplomat, John Slidell, to negotiate the purchase of California and New Mexico, a mission that, unsurprisingly, failed before it even began. So, there they stood, on opposite banks of a river neither side could agree on. Tensions ran high. Mexican troops crossed the river in April 1846, and somewhere in the dusty borderlands, shots were fired. Soldiers were killed, blood seeped into the earth. Polk seized the moment. He declared to Congress that American blood has been shed on American soil, though whether it was truly American soil remained the central argument. Still, Congress took the bait. War was declared. But it all started years before, with Texas, with a battle in a forgotten mission, and with the stubborn belief that land could be claimed by whoever was willing to fight hardest for it. There's something almost eerily familiar about it, isn't there? The slow creep of ambition, the sharpening of borders, the way memory is turned into myth. I sometimes wonder how different it would have been if someone, anyone, had listened more closely, if pride hadn't spoken so loudly. The first clashes of 1846 revealed just how fragile the peace had become along the disputed borderlands. After months of rising tension, Mexican and American forces found themselves drawn into a confrontation neither truly desired, yet one that felt inevitable, given the deep mistrust and conflicting claims over the land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. What started as small skirmishes soon spiraled into full-scale conflict. On April 25th, Mexican troops, under the command of General Anastasio Torrejon, engaged a U.S. patrol led by Captain Seth Thornton in a brush near the Rio Grande. Thornton's men were outnumbered and quickly overwhelmed, a clash that the U.S. government seized on with urgency. President James K. Polk, addressing Congress just days later, declared that American blood has been shed on American soil, a phrase that would resonate deeply across the nation and push the reluctant country into war. The phrase itself was not without controversy, as the exact boundaries of American soil were fiercely debated, but for Polk, it was the necessary call to rally public support. The political landscape in the United States was not unanimously in favor of this war. Figures like Congressman Abraham Lincoln voiced strong opposition, questioning the legitimacy of the border claims and accusing the administration of manufacturing a pretext for expansion. Henry David Thoreau famously refused to pay taxes to a government engaged in what he considered an unjust war, spending a night in jail for his act of civil disobedience. These voices remind us that even as the cannons fired, the nation was deeply divided, wrestling with the morality of the conflict. Meanwhile, on the ground, the fighting was swift and decisive. The early battles along the Rio Grande set the tone for much of the campaign. At Fort Texas, a small but strategic American outpost near present-day Brownsville, Mexican forces laid siege in late May. Though the fort held, the defenders faced constant bombardment and harsh conditions, their resilience becoming a symbol of American resolve. Nearby, at Palo Alto on May 8th, the first major battle unfolded under the scorching Texas sun. The battle was marked by the innovative use of artillery by General Zachary Taylor's troops, whose flying artillery could rapidly reposition and deliver devastating fire. This tactical advantage helped secure a rare but significant victory for the Americans. These early successes shifted momentum sharply. The U.S. forces, initially on uncertain footing, began pressing south with confidence, while Mexican troops, under General Santa Anna, struggled to coordinate a coherent defense. Santa Anna himself had returned from exile to lead the Mexican army, a figure of considerable charisma and controversy. His leadership, though passionate, was often undermined by political infighting and lack of resources. It's worth noting that the Mexican army, despite setbacks, fought fiercely and with considerable bravery, driven by a profound sense of defending their homeland against what many saw as an imperialistic invasion. On the American side, the war quickly became a proving ground for many future leaders. Ulysses S. Grant, then a young officer, witnessed the brutal realities of combat firsthand. He later described the campaign as a mixture of horror and fascination, recognizing both the strategic challenges and the human cost. Robert E. Lee, who would become a central figure in the Civil War, also served with distinction, tasked with mapping and engineering duties crucial to the campaign's success. These men, alongside countless others, were shaped by their experiences here, their views forged in the crucible of this conflict. Despite victories, the war was far from a simple march of conquest. The borderlands were unforgiving, the landscape itself a formidable opponent. Sweltering heat, scarce water, and rugged terrain tested the endurance of soldiers on both sides. Disease often claimed more lives than bullets. Letters from soldiers reveal a grim reality behind the glory, describing nights haunted by the cries of the wounded and the constant anxiety of unexpected attacks. It's easy to overlook these details when recalling battles, but they form an essential part of understanding the human experience of the war. One remarkable aspect often overlooked is the role of Tejanos, Mexican Texans, caught in the middle of this conflict. Their loyalties were complex, shaped by personal ties and survival instincts. Some sided with the US, others remained fiercely loyal to Mexico, and many simply sought to protect their homes amid the chaos. Their stories complicate the narrative of a clear-cut national struggle and remind us how war disrupts communities in ways that official histories rarely capture. As the US forces pressed further into Mexican territory, they encountered not only military resistance, but also a determined civilian population. The war's impact rippled through towns and villages, with families caught between armies, their lives upended. The press coverage from both countries reflected a mixture of patriotic fervor and human tragedy, though often filtered through nationalistic lenses. Mexican newspapers mourned the loss of land and sovereignty, while American papers celebrated the apparent fulfillment of destiny. This early phase of the war, marked by battles along the border and in northern Mexico, set a pattern of fierce combat combined with political posturing. It was a conflict where every victory was shadowed by the toll it took on soldiers and civilians alike. And as the American army prepared to push deeper into the heart of Mexico, the war's complexity would only deepen, revealing layers of courage, desperation, and the tragic costs of a young nation's ambitions. The march deeper into Mexico unfolded like a grim odyssey, one that would test the mettle of soldiers, shape nations, and etch stories into the very soil they fought over. After securing the borderlands, General Zachary Taylor's forces pressed southward, with a mixture of caution and urgency. Monterrey, a sprawling city of adobe walls and narrow streets, stood as a crucial prize. Capturing it was more than just a military objective. It was a message that the conflict had left the border behind and was now a true invasion. Taylor's army laid siege in September of 1846, maneuvering through the city's maze-like layout, where every corner seemed to hide a potential ambush. Mexican defenders, under General Pedro de Ampudia, fought fiercely, using the city's buildings as fortresses and sniping positions. What often gets overlooked is the tactical complexity of urban combat in this era. Without modern artillery or air support, both sides relied heavily on infantry skirmishes, reconnaissance by scouts, and the coordination of small units. The battle's intensity was captured in letters sent home by soldiers, who spoke of the choking dust, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off stone walls, and the eerie calm that followed brief lulls in fighting. One such letter, from a private named William Jennings, described the nights in Monterrey as a strange silence broken only by distant cries and the rustling of footsteps in the darkness, conveying a haunting atmosphere amid the chaos. Yet, after days of fierce engagement, a truce was arranged. Monterrey's defenders negotiated a withdrawal, allowing Taylor's troops to claim the city. But the victory came at a cost. Hundreds lay wounded or dead, and both armies understood that the war was far from over. Meanwhile, in the northern highlands, another fierce encounter was brewing. At the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847, Taylor's smaller force faced off against a much larger Mexican army, commanded by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the very general whose ambitions had sparked so much tension years earlier. Despite being outnumbered, American troops held firm, their discipline and artillery making a difference on the rugged battlefield. Soldier accounts from this battle are filled with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. "The thunder of cannon shook the very ground beneath our feet," wrote Lieutenant James Polk, who noted that the men held their ground, though some seemed to stand on the edge of despair. Santa Anna's repeated attempts to break the lines were met with stubborn resistance, but the battle ended inconclusively, leaving both sides bloodied and wary. Beyond the northern front, the most audacious campaign of the war was underway. General Winfield Scott, often called Old Fuss and Feathers for his strict discipline and immaculate uniforms, orchestrated a daring amphibious assault on Veracruz in March 1847. This was a turning point. Instead of fighting at the border, American forces landed hundreds of miles south on the Gulf Coast, directly threatening the heart of Mexico. The landing itself was a logistical feat. Ships had to navigate shallow waters and avoid Mexican coastal defenses. Troops disembarked under heavy fire, but established a beachhead that would become the launching point for a grueling march inland. Veracruz, a bustling port city, was surrounded and bombarded for several weeks, with artillery shells tearing through the city's fortifications and civilian districts alike. Letters from Mexican civilians tell of the terror and disruption. Women and children fleeing homes, markets deserted, and an ever-present smoke that hung in the air. After Veracruz fell in late March, Scott's army began its slow, arduous advance toward Mexico City. The campaign stretched over months, crossing rivers, climbing hills, and contending with supply shortages and disease. The march was more than a series of battles. It was a test of endurance and willpower. Soldiers wrote about the oppressive heat, the dust choking their throats, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The culminating conflict came at Chapultepec, a fortress perched on a hill overlooking Mexico City. It was guarded not only by seasoned troops, but also by a group of young cadets, later immortalized as the Niños Héroes. These boys, some as young as 13, refused to surrender and fought to the last breath. Their story became a poignant symbol of Mexican patriotism and sacrifice. One cadet, Juan Escutia, is said to have wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and leapt from the fortress walls, rather than let the banner fall into enemy hands. The battle itself was brutal. American forces launched multiple assaults against well-fortified positions, facing fierce resistance from soldiers and citizens alike. Newspaper reports from the time described smoke-filled skies, desperate hand-to-hand combat, and the eerie silence that followed the storm of violence. Mexican civilian accounts tell of homes caught in the crossfire, of families torn apart, and of a city that seemed to hold its breath as the outcome unfolded. But Mexico City finally fell in September 1847. It marked the end of major combat operations, but the cost had been staggering. Thousands lay dead or wounded on both sides, and the city was left scarred and weary. Letters from American soldiers express a mix of triumph and melancholy, acknowledging the human toll behind the victory. What strikes me when reading these personal narratives is how much this war, often overshadowed by other conflicts, revealed the complexity of human endurance and tragedy. It was not just a clash of armies, but of cultures, dreams, and harsh realities. The battles from Monterrey to Mexico City shaped not only borders, but the memories and identities of millions. The gates of Mexico City had barely fallen when the real struggle began. Not the one fought with muskets and sabers, but the quieter, colder war, fought with ink and negotiation. After 2 years of bloodshed, diplomacy took center stage. And at that center sat a document, heavy with promise and betrayal, called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It was February 2nd, 1848. The city of Guadalupe Hidalgo, just north of Mexico's battered capital, became the unlikely backdrop for a decision that would redraw nearly half a continent. The ink dried slowly in the chill of winter, pressed into parchment by men who knew what was at stake. On the American side, Nicholas Trist, a diplomat sent by President Polk, signed the treaty and then was promptly fired for exceeding his orders. Trist had defied Polk's wishes by refusing to demand more territory, specifically Baja California, fearing that continued conquest would only worsen the conflict. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "Could I have gone on my own feeling, I would not have signed. But we were in Mexico. The armies had done their part. The rest was mine." The treaty did not come easy. For months, negotiations had stalled, twisted by politics, language, and pride. In Mexico, the interim government faced the impossible choice between total collapse or signing away nearly half the country's land. In the United States, some politicians argued that the war should continue until the entirety of Mexico was annexed. Others feared the implications of incorporating so many non-white Catholic citizens into a predominantly Protestant republic. Still, the deal was struck. The US would pay $15 million to Mexico, a sum that sounds generous on paper, but was little compensation for the more than 500,000 square miles lost. That included all of California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. A strip of desert land nearly the size of Western Europe was handed over in a single, reluctant signature. And in addition, the US agreed to assume $3.25 million in claims that American citizens said Mexico owed them from previous property damages. On both sides of the border, people read the headlines with disbelief. Some celebrated, some mourned, and many simply didn't understand what had just happened. What fascinates me, and maybe you felt this too, is how treaties always sound neat and final in textbooks, like someone closed a door with a firm, clean click. But in reality, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo didn't close anything. It cracked open an entirely new era of uncertainty. Take, for instance, Article 8 of the treaty. It promised that Mexicans living in the newly ceded territories could choose to remain Mexican citizens or become Americans. It also guaranteed the protection of their property rights, their religion, and their civil liberties. In theory, it was a graceful olive branch, but in practice, those protections dissolved almost immediately. Any Mexican landowners, especially in California and New Mexico, found their property titles questioned or outright ignored. American lawyers, surveyors, and speculators pounced like vultures on the legal ambiguity. A common tactic was to drag cases out in court until the original owners ran out of money to defend their claims. Families who had lived on their land for generations watched it slip away, not with gunfire, but with paperwork. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Senate ratified the treaty, but quietly struck out Article 10, the one that would have explicitly recognized land grants made by the Mexican government before the war. It was a silent knife in the back, Without that clause, the land rights of countless Mexican citizens were left hanging by a thread. Back in Mexico, the national psyche absorbed a deep wound. The war had been humiliating, and the treaty felt like salt in the cut. Nationalists called it la traición, the betrayal. Monuments were built in memory of fallen soldiers, like the Niños heroes who had defended Chapultepec Castle, and those memorials became symbols of defiance and sorrow. To this day, many Mexicans refer to the conflict not as the Mexican-American War, but simply La Intervención Norteamericana, the North American intervention. And even for the United States, the end of the war didn't bring peace of mind. The new land, as vast and glittering as it appeared, immediately opened the floodgates of sectional conflict. Would slavery be allowed in these new territories? Would free labor be protected? Every new map drawn sparked new fires in Congress, many of which smoldered straight into the 1860s. I always find it revealing that General Ulysses S. Grant, who had fought in the war as a young officer, later reflected on it with quiet bitterness. In his memoirs, he wrote, "I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico." Coming from the man who would go on to lead the Union Army in the Civil War, that's not a casual remark. He saw firsthand how the spoils of that treaty would ripple through the decades, fueling injustice, division, and a sense of unfinished business. One story that often gets left out, maybe because it feels too quiet, is about the Mexican delegates themselves. People like Bernardo Couto, Miguel Atrastain, and Luis Cuevas. They weren't soldiers, and they didn't make headlines. But they were the ones who sat across from American diplomats, trying to salvage dignity in a negotiation where the balance of power was completely lopsided. One of them reportedly wept after signing, not for himself, but for a Mexico he feared had been forever diminished. That sadness echoes in strange ways, sometimes in place names that still carry both languages, side by side, sometimes in legal battles over land grants that remain unresolved more than 150 years later, and sometimes in the simple fact that a treaty meant to bring peace ended up drawing a line that would remain deeply contested, right up to the present day. It's strange to think how much of modern America was formed not by revolution, but by paperwork signed in a cold room in a town most people have never heard of. Guadalupe Hidalgo, a name easy to forget, tied to a treaty that changed everything. It wasn't long after the ink dried on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that the real struggle began for the people who had never left their homes, but suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of a new border. One day, they were Mexican citizens. The next, they were residents of the United States. But what did that mean in practice? What did it mean for a rancher in New Mexico, or a widow in California, or an indigenous elder whose homeland now had a new name and flag? The treaty had promised protections. On paper, anyway. Article 8 assured that property rights would be respected. Article 9 guaranteed the full rights of U.S. citizenship for Mexicans in the ceded lands, should they choose to remain. But the ground shifted beneath those promises almost immediately. In the years following the war, courts in the American Southwest filled with land dispute cases. Many Mexican landowners, or Californios as they were known in California, held titles that went back decades, sometimes centuries, grants from Spanish or Mexican governments. But these documents were written in Spanish, often vaguely worded, and suddenly subject to the scrutiny of an English-speaking legal system that was suspicious, unfamiliar, and frequently corrupt. There's a tragic rhythm to many of these stories. Legal battles dragged on for years, fees mounted. Many Californios were forced to sell their land just to afford attorneys. Others lost everything to squatters, loopholes, or outright fraud. The Land Act of 1851 required Mexican landowners to prove their claims, a process that sounds fair on paper, but in reality became a slow bleed. Historian Richard Griswold del Castillo once described it as legalized dispossession. It's hard to argue with that. And then there were the people who weren't even recognized by the treaty, the indigenous nations. The United States had not negotiated with them. It had negotiated over them. The Apache, the Navajo, the Comanche, and many other tribes suddenly found themselves living within a country that didn't acknowledge their sovereignty or their history. The Mexican government, for all its flaws, had at least entered into treaties with some tribes and recognized certain lands as theirs. That was gone now. In the 1850s and 60s, US military campaigns pushed deeper into indigenous lands, especially in Arizona and New Mexico. The pattern was sadly familiar: forced relocations, broken treaties, scorched earth tactics. In 1864, the US Army forced some 8,000 Navajo people to march over 300 miles to a barren outpost called Bosque Redondo. Hundreds died along the way. The survivors arrived at the place with no resources, no homes, and no hope. That event, known today as the Long Walk, is etched in memory as one of the most painful consequences of a war that never truly ended for the people it displaced. Meanwhile, in the cities and towns that now flew American flags, a quieter form of erasure took place. Mexican Americans, or Mexicanos, were increasingly treated as foreigners in their own ancestral lands. English became the language of law, education, and commerce. Public offices were rarely held by Spanish-speaking citizens. Schools discouraged, or outright punished, the use of Spanish. Racial hierarchies hardened, and darker-skinned citizens found themselves pushed to the margins. You can hear some of these echoes in the personal accounts left behind. In an 1876 testimony, a Mexican-American rancher named Jose Maria Amador said, "They called us foreigners, but we were here before the Americans ever arrived." How could we be foreigners? There's something quietly devastating about that. A man whose family had lived on the land for generations, his existence suddenly reframed as temporary. Women too bore a specific weight. Many Californians lost their inheritance rights under American law. Under the Mexican legal system, women had more control over property and contracts than their Anglo-American counterparts. But now, those legal norms disappeared. Some women who had once managed vast ranchos became tenants on the land their fathers had built. Still, people adapted. Some communities held on fiercely to language, traditions, and Catholic rituals. In places like northern New Mexico, local power structures resisted Americanization more successfully, at least for a while. The Penitente Brotherhood, for example, continued its spiritual and community roles, quietly asserting Mexican Catholic identity in the face of cultural pressure. And there were also acts of resistance, small, everyday rebellions. In Texas, Tejano leaders challenged Anglo encroachment in court. In California, newspapers like El Clamor Público, published in Los Angeles in the 1850s, gave voice to young Mexican Americans demanding justice, rights, and dignity. One editorial read, "We are not guests, we are heirs." I find that sentence incredibly moving. It's not a demand for pity, but a reminder that these people were not newcomers, but part of a long-rooted story that the new border couldn't erase. Of course, memory is selective, and history is often written by the victors. For a long time, the official story of the Mexican-American War focused on glory, conquest, and manifest destiny. The suffering of those caught in the middle was an afterthought, if mentioned at all. But their lives mattered. Their stories are still alive in the adobe homes, the family cemeteries, the Spanish place names that dot the Southwest. They're in the music, the food, the language, the rituals passed down in whispers at kitchen tables. And when you start to listen closely, you begin to understand that this war didn't really end in 1848. It just changed shape. Some changes arrive like storms, loud and chaotic, impossible to ignore. Others creep in quietly, disguised as opportunity. In the aftermath of the war, just as dust settled over the scorched battlefields and new borders were drawn in ink, an unexpected fever swept across the land, not one of illness, but of gold. It was January of 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo hadn't even been signed yet, when James W. Marshall spotted flakes of gold shimmering in the tail race of a sawmill he was helping to build for John Sutter, just outside of what would soon be known as Sacramento. News traveled slowly at first, like a whisper passing through canyons, but by the end of that year, the whisper had become a thunderous stampede. The gold rush was on. What followed was one of the most explosive migrations in American history. By 1849, over 90,000 people had arrived in California, fortune seekers from the East Coast, Mexico, Chile, China, and beyond. all drawn to the wild promise of instant wealth. They came by land, by sea, by any means they could. Entire towns sprang up seemingly overnight, tents and timber, dreams and desperation. But the real story isn't the one of sudden riches. It's about what was lost in the shadows of that gold. California had only just become part of the United States, ceded by Mexico only months before. And the people who already lived there, indigenous tribes, Mexican ranchers, Californio families, were quickly swallowed up by the chaos. Their languages, customs, even their legal land titles were swept aside in the rush for mineral wealth. American courts often dismissed Spanish land grants outright, and many former landowners were stripped of their estates with little more than a shrug. In one court testimony from 1853, a Californio rancher named Don Manuel Michel Terrena stated bitterly, "They said my papers were not the right kind, but I had the land since before they had a flag." That sentiment echoed in thousands of families across the state. Meanwhile, indigenous peoples faced a far darker fate. The gold rush coincided with what many historians now consider a campaign of extermination. In 1851, California's first governor, Peter Burnett, openly declared that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. These weren't just words. State and local governments paid bounties for native scalps, and militias were funded with public money to carry out violent campaigns against tribes in the Sierra Nevada and Central Valley. The Yuki, Madu, and Wintu peoples saw their numbers collapse within a single generation. Others were rounded up and forced into servitude under California's Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, a law that effectively legalized the kidnapping and indentured servitude of native children and adults. In mining camps, indigenous people were beaten or murdered for approaching the gold-bearing rivers that had once belonged to their ancestors. Even the Chinese immigrants, who arrived by the thousands beginning in 1850, found themselves met with hostility. Though many played a vital role in the economy, working in mines, laundries, and building the railroads, they were subjected to special taxes, legal discrimination, and widespread violence. One of the first laws passed by California's new legislature was the foreign miners' tax, which charged non-American miners a monthly fee simply for existing in the goldfields. It was targeted specifically at Mexicans and Chinese laborers. Yet, in all this turmoil, a strange kind of order did begin to emerge. The arrival of so many people created pressure for infrastructure, governance, and law. By 1850, California was fast-tracked into statehood, skipping the usual process and leapfrogging over the territorial stage entirely. It became the 31st state on September 9th of that year, less than 2 years after the end of the war. But this rush toward development brought its own consequences. Law enforcement was often more symbolic than real, especially in remote boomtowns where justice could be decided by the fastest draw or the loudest voice. Vigilante groups formed, lynchings were common. And beneath the surface of gold fever, there was always an edge of desperation, of men and women chasing a glimmer that stayed just out of reach. Even the land itself bore the scars. Hydraulic mining, a technique developed in the 1850s, used high-pressure water cannons to wash away entire hillsides, sending sediments downriver and choking the valleys with debris. Rivers changed course, forests vanished, indigenous fishing grounds were buried in mud. Still, not everything about the gold rush was destruction. Some communities carved out spaces for survival. Others adapted. Chinese immigrants built Chinatowns in San Francisco and Sacramento, planting the seeds of rich cultural legacies. Some Californios managed to hold on to their lands and transitioned into new roles as merchants and politicians in the growing cities. And for a few miners, a very lucky few, the gold was real. Nuggets the size of walnuts, veins that glittered in the courts, stories that still get passed around campfires and back porches. I often wonder what it must have felt like to arrive in California in 1849, stepping off a ship or trudging overland through the Sierra Nevada, your boots soaked and your hands blistered, staring at a golden sunrise over hills that promised everything and nothing. That moment of hope, suspended like dust in morning light. Of course, history has a way of sanding off those moments. We're left with census records and court transcripts, old photographs, and place names. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The clang of picks against stone, the shouts in half a dozen languages, the riverbeds being turned upside down. The gold rush wasn't just an event. It was a spark that accelerated everything. Settlement, dispossession, statehood. It fused greed and optimism, conquest and invention, into something uniquely American. While gold fever was rewriting the economic script of the American Southwest, something darker and more divisive was stirring just beneath the surface. Something that gold alone couldn't buy off or distract from. The vast new territories acquired after the war had to be organized, governed, and, most explosively, categorized. Were they to be free or slaveholding? That single question would send ripples through the nation's conscience, and eventually, it would shatter the fragile balance that barely held the Union together. Slavery, which had always haunted the edges of American expansion, now stepped into the center of the national debate. The Mexican-American War, short though it was, had opened a Pandora's box. Every acre of land gained brought with it a new battleground, not just of soil, but of ideology. Southern leaders had supported the war with great enthusiasm, often framing it as a God-given opportunity to expand their way of life, including the institution of slavery, into the West. Men like Senator John C. Calhoun argued that the territories were the property of all states, and thus slaveholders had the right to bring enslaved people into them. To many in the South, the war wasn't just about land. It was about preserving a way of life under threat. In contrast, Northern abolitionists viewed the war and its aftermath with deep suspicion. Congressman Joshua Giddings called the conflict a war for slavery, and abolitionist newspapers warned that every mile gained was a step closer to an empire built on bondage. Henry David Thoreau, who had already opposed the war with his act of civil disobedience, wrote bitterly about a country marching to the tune of a drum soaked in human suffering. One of the clearest voices amid the noise came from a little-known Illinois congressman, Abraham Lincoln. During his brief time in the House of Representatives, Lincoln introduced what became known as the Spot Resolutions, demanding that President Polk specify the exact location, the spot, where American blood had been shed on American soil. He was ridiculed for it, nicknamed Spotty Lincoln, but his questions were sharp and prophetic. The deeper reality was this. The war had given the United States land, but not consensus. The Compromise of 1850 tried to put out the fire, admitting California as a free state, but also strengthening the fugitive slave law. It was a political band-aid over a wound that kept bleeding, and though few would have admitted it at the time, the blood spilled along the Rio Grande in 1846 was, in some way, a prelude to the torrents that would stain Antietam and Gettysburg. What makes the connection even more haunting is how many of the Civil War's leading generals had cut their teeth in the Mexican-American War. Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, they all served there. Grant later confessed that he thought the war was one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker one. He believed it had been driven by greed and ambition, and that the experience haunted him. In his memoirs, Grant wrote, "I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time, only I had not the moral courage to resign." That quiet admission carries so much weight. A man who would lead the Union to victory in the bloodiest conflict in American history admitted he lacked the courage to object to its earlier sin. Robert E. Lee, on the other side, earned distinction for his engineering work and bravery during the Mexico campaign. Many historians believe it was during this war that he gained the strategic insight and calm under fire that would later define him. It's eerie, really, how the roads into Mexico became proving grounds for a coming war that no one wanted to name yet. And then, there's the issue of memory. The war didn't end in 1848. It continued, in a sense, through courtroom battles over land grants, in vigilante violence against Mexican Americans, and through legal segregation. There were acts of resistance too, often quiet, often undocumented. In New Mexico, Hispano communities would come together in secret to preserve their language, religion, and land claims. In California, indigenous leaders who had survived the missions and gold rush violence continued oral traditions that recorded their side of the story of a land not won, but taken. Even today, the shadow of the war stretches long. Debates over immigration, border security, and cultural identity often echo the divisions first carved into the soil during the 1840s. You can still feel it along the Rio Grande, where monuments mark old battlefields, but not the lives lost in legal papers, forced marches, or vanishing property deeds. I sometimes think of how odd it is that so few Americans know this war deeply. We remember the Civil War with movies, reenactments, monuments. But this earlier conflict that shaped so much of the land and the conversation barely makes it into classrooms. Maybe because it was quick. Maybe because it was inconvenient. Or maybe because, like Grant, we're still struggling with the reasons behind it. And still, the echoes remain, not in the drums of war anymore, but in census forms, school names, land disputes, and the border wall debates that carry a strange familiarity. You can almost hear the voices underneath it all, not shouting, just waiting to be heard. There's something quietly surreal about standing in the Southwest today. The sun casts long shadows across adobe walls, Spanish and English mingle in street signs, and the smell of mesquite smoke drifts past roadside shrines to the Virgin of Guadalupe. You can drive from San Diego to Santa Fe and never quite leave the echoes of that old war behind. They linger, not just in the names of places, or in the scars carved into the land, but in the identities of the people who live here. In some towns along the Rio Grande, families have lived on the same land since before there was a United States or a Mexico. And yet, their nationalities changed around them, flags raised and lowered above the same hills, while the people beneath them stayed rooted like the cottonwoods. One elderly man in New Mexico, interviewed in the 1990s, said it plainly. My grandfather was born a Mexican. My father was born an American. I was born confused. The legacy of the Mexican-American War isn't frozen in time. It's living, shifting, pulled into every debate about immigration, identity, and land. You can see it in the murals that cover Los Angeles freeway underpasses, where Aztec gods share space with lowriders and bald eagles. You can hear it in the music, the food, the way generations blend languages without thinking about it. And yet, for all that mixing, there's tension too. In Texas, for example, recent fights over curriculum standards in public schools have brought the war back into public view. In 2010, a proposed textbook described Mexican Americans in the 19th century as lazy and unproductive, causing outrage from historians and civil rights groups. Those were direct echoes of 19th century rhetoric, the same language used to justify conquest and displacement, still trying to shape the story more than 150 years later. And then there are the monuments. Some celebrate American generals with stern marble gazes, while others commemorate Mexican resistance with weeping bronze figures. One striking example is the Miños Héroes monument in Chapultepec Park in Mexico City. 6 cadets, barely more than boys, who refused to surrender during the 1847 invasion. The youngest reportedly wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and leapt from the fortress walls. They became symbols of patriotism, of sacrifice. Across the border, however, they're rarely mentioned. It's one war, but 2 memories. That duality runs deeper still. For many Mexican Americans, the war isn't just history, it's ancestry. The border crossed their families, not the other way around. Movements like the Chicano civil rights push of the 1960s and 70s drew strength from that idea. They said, "We didn't immigrate, we were annexed." And that sentiment still lingers in modern activism. It's on t-shirts that read, "We didn't cross the border crossed us," and in grassroots campaigns to preserve Spanish language education and reclaim land rights. In 2006, during massive immigration protests in cities across the US, you could see protesters waving both American and Mexican flags, side by side. To some onlookers, it was confusing, even offensive. But for many, it was a declaration of identity, forged in history. These weren't foreign ideas clashing, but generations of experience layered on top of each other. Even in environmental policy, the old war shadow stretches on. The land ceded by Mexico includes some of the most ecologically delicate and politically fraught terrain in North America. National parks like Big Bend in Texas or Organ Pipe Cactus in Arizona sit right on the border, their wildlife corridors disrupted by fences, patrol roads, and surveillance towers. In the 21st century, debates over the border wall revived painful memories for some indigenous and Latino communities. Because when the government comes with bulldozers and blueprints, history often repeats itself, not as theatre, but as quiet erasure. Yet it's not all tragedy. In fact, some of the most beautiful aspects of Southwestern life come directly from this complicated legacy. Festivals like Dia de los Muertos thrive in places like Albuquerque and Tucson, blending Catholic tradition with indigenous roots. Bilingual poetry slams and mariachi competitions are held in high school gymnasiums. Cities like El Paso and San Diego have become living mosaics, places where past and present cohabitate, sometimes uncomfortably, but always visibly. And there's something quietly powerful about that, about the way history leaves fingerprints rather than footprints, about the way culture refuses to be erased, even when borders try to cut through it. Still, questions remain. Who gets to tell the story of the war? What's left out of textbooks, and why? Are we taught about Winfield Scott's military genius, but not the mass graves left behind his march? Are we taught about Zachary Taylor's battlefield victories, but not the civilian displacement that followed? What do we do with the testimony of people whose ancestors were labelled foreigners on their own land? These are hard questions, but they're not abstract ones. They live in policy, in protest, in art, and the way children learn the Pledge of Allegiance in English, then go home and pray in Spanish, in the uneasy laughter at a joke that crosses cultural lines, in the way some names on street signs are pronounced differently depending on who's saying them. The Mexican-American War didn't end in 1848. It simply changed form. It became woven into the story of America itself, into its expansion, its contradictions, its triumphs, and its failures. And the Southwest remains its echo chamber. Every time a family argues over land ownership, traced back to an 1850s land grant, every time someone debates what it means to be American or Mexican or both, every time history is bent for political gain. And maybe that's the final lesson, that wars don't just redraw maps, they redraw identities. They plant seeds that grow slowly, stubbornly, in soil made of memory and pride and pain. Thank you for wandering through this long, quiet chapter of history with me. I hope it left you thinking, even just a little, about how the past lingers in the ground we walk on, and in the names we call home. If you found this story meaningful, or simply calming, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be back soon with another quiet journey into the strange, beautiful threads of history that still shape our nights. Sleep well, or drive safe, whatever brought you here. Until next time.